So welcome everyone to Canada Wildfire webinar. Today we have Dr. Chris Hopkinson and Laura Chasmer. They're going to talk to us about using LiDAR to quantify pre and post-fire vegetation structure. And before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm currently situated on Treaty 6 territory and the home of the Métis Nation of Alberta. So today, Laura and Chris are going to talk to us about LiDAR, which is a really hot topic and something we've had a lot of interest in at Canada Wildfire. And I personally am really looking forward to this one. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Laura first, and then you'll hear from Chris.
Thanks very much, Karen, and it's really great to see everyone this morning. Today we're going to talk about from laser points to information using LiDAR to quantify pre and post-fire vegetation structure. I'm an associate professor here at the University of Lethbridge, and I've been working on LiDAR systems with Chris for almost 20 years. So with that, Chris, did you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Hopkinson, professor and research chair in the Department of Geography and Environment at the University of Lethbridge. So I've been working on LiDAR for about 22, almost 23 years now, and not traditionally in the wildfire domain. That's really more Laura's domain. I'm kind of a little bit more general, but certainly forestry and hydrology is my background. So we have two parts to today's presentation. I'll be taking over part one, which is the more generic kind of LiDAR 101 and some introduction to the research areas we deal with in my lab, the Artemis lab at the University of Lethbridge. And then I'll hand over to Laura for part two, where she'll get into some of the more nitty gritty of the use of LiDAR for fuels. Laura, was there anything else you wanted to say before we carry on?
No, I think that's good. Yeah, and I guess we can start.
Okay, thanks. Well, with that, let's move on. Let's just make sure PowerPoint works. Yeah, okay. So LiDAR, the acronym, Light Detection and Ranging. I'm sure you've all heard this and have some idea about what it is, but let's start with this little cartoon, this animation. So what we have is a laser sensor that emits a light pulse. Can be anywhere in the shortwave spectrum, but very often in the near infrared. And so basically we utilize this technology to measure the range from the sensor to the target. And then once we've measured the round trip travel time, we divide that by 2 and we get the range. So very simple concept of ranging using the speed of light. And then we can essentially strap that LiDAR sensor to a number of different platforms and turn it into a mapping technology. Now, truth is, I have been teaching LiDAR for over 20 years now. And so I do have a lot of material, but I have about half an hour to speak. So the 101 element of this seminar is going to be extremely brief because we want to touch on a lot of different topics. Now, I do believe in one of the earlier webinars, you will have been exposed to terrestrial laser scanners. So I'll start there. We do have a couple of terrestrial laser scanners in my lab, so we have some familiarity there. In fact, it was my lab that pioneered the use of TLS, that's the acronym, back in 2002 for forest plot data extraction for fairly standard forest inventory variables. So the technology and the applications have come a long, long way since then. But it's a good place to start because it's a fairly accessible technology from an academic or a commercial point of view. You don't need any particular special licenses. Most of these sensors are eye-safe, and you know, pricing in the $10,000 to $100,000 range make it relatively accessible as a sophisticated survey technology. And I do believe that one of the earlier presentations by Patrick James would have introduced you to this technology. So that's why we're starting there. But this slide gives you a bit of a flavor for the different configurations of these systems. But the bottom line is they can give you a 3D point cloud from anything from 1 meter away to a few kilometers away, and down to the millimeter to centimeter level of resolution, and several thousand or even potentially million points within a cubic meter of volumetric space. So you get very detailed three-dimensional information out of these technologies. And once you have that kind of data, there's a lot you can do with it, of course. You can segment tree stems from their branches, from their foliage, and you can utilize this information for things like species recognition or biomass extraction and other fuels. Laura will talk more specifically about fuels later on. I'm just looking at some of the more generic elements. And so incidentally, this is some of the work by a former PhD student of mine, now a postdoc, working with Laura and I on some of his individual tree isolation, component segmentation, and then classification. So a lot of this, these workflows utilize machine learning, deep learning, and artificial intelligence routines. Given this as an intro talk, I won't be getting into any of those methods. So suffice it to say that these are things you can do if you know how to work with the associated code. Now, of course, LiDAR is not restricted to tripod-based terrestrial laser scanners. There are many, many flavors of LiDAR sensor out there, all the way from handheld or backpack mounted systems that can, you know, where the platform is the human being or the human operator, to vehicular mounted systems, to airborne systems, to satellite systems. And in fact, LiDAR is not always utilizing lasers. Essentially, it's light, right? That's the first part of the acronym, light. But we often think, oh, it's all lasers. But no, as you can see in the bottom right-hand corner here, we have this little LED-based detection, which is also LiDAR. In my lab, we've even employed these low-powered, low-cost LED LiDAR systems for three-dimensional mapping as well. And it would be remiss of me not to mention the good old Xbox 360, if any of you remember that. Any of you that are old enough, I think most kids don't interact with these things anymore. But basically a light-based three-dimensional ranging camera system. And you can do quite a lot with that too. So these technologies come in lots of different shapes and forms. And but the bottom line is they all provide three-dimensional data or three-dimensional point clouds. So just one example, this is going back about 10 years or so now. In fact, I purchased an Xbox and an Xbox 360 Connect to do some homegrown research. And this is just an illustration of that now. So you got this $200 consumer-grade flash LiDAR and hook it up to your computer, get some open source code, and you can build your own laser scanner. And so that's what you can see here is a Christmas tree. And the little animation just saw us rotating around that. So this is something that consumers can do. We don't have to be, you know, multi-million-dollar labs with airplanes and access to satellite data or anything quite so sophisticated. Sticking with the kind of low-cost consumer-level technologies, Xiaojin also built his own little robotic scanner. So analogous to a terrestrial laser scanner where we might be spending tens of thousands of dollars or even $100,000, he built the same kind of thing, but used an LED. And so you can see this here, and it's mounted on a survey and a gimbal and a Pelican case. And so we just built it, programmed it with a Raspberry Pi, and it can rotate and it can scan the environment around it. And I believe the materials, the whole thing put together was just probably $300 or $400. So not a particularly expensive piece of equipment from a manufacturing point of view. And this is what you get out of it. You can build a three-dimensional point cloud. And the purpose or the application we were trying to develop was to develop a full 360 hemispherical point cloud for leaf air index imaging. There's a lot of research on this, but we were just trying to come up with a low-cost way of doing it. Now, I guess one of the relatively new kids on the block in terms of LiDAR technology in an operational context, of course, is UAVs or RPAS, remote piloted aircraft systems. And so here you can see a DJI Matrice 300 RTK with a Zenmuse L1 LiDAR. And so this is probably one of the lower cost systems that's available. Just a heads up, that platform and that laser system is in the realm of $50,000, and nominally you'll get about 1,000 points per square meter, and so a lot of potential for forestry-based mapping. And so, of course, that's what we use it for, and we've added the Matrice to our more traditional optically based drone platforms. So before I skip ahead to airborne LiDAR, which is what I want to focus most of my time on, I just want to illustrate what some of the LiDAR, what some of the data, point cloud data from the Matrice and the L1 actually looks like. Now, many of us will be familiar with photogrammetric techniques, of course, and there's almost a century of development in terms of optical photogrammetric techniques. And so UAVs, of course, exploit this to develop structure from motion-based point clouds. And so what you see here is a forested environment, actually in Jasper National Park. There's some pine beetle in there. That's why you can see the kind of change in colorization. Here we have a fen. So you can see that kind of three-dimensionality, colorization of the point cloud, but this is a purely optical data set. And so if we run a cross section approximately through here, then you can see on the left, here's that vertical profile through that environment. So even with the optical structure from motion, this is without any kind of active laser system, we still get a lot of structural information. We can fairly easily pull out individual tree stems, and we can see some of the structure in the canopy. But now if we look at this same environment utilizing the LiDAR collected at exactly the same time, same platform, this is what we get. Now, you may notice it's very, very slightly more blurry, but the information content is much more rich. If you look through the canopy here, exactly the same profile, same width of cross section, we get a lot more information all the way down into the lowest parts of the canopy there. And this is really illustrated if we transpose these two cross sections. So in green, we've got the optical structure from motion point cloud. Here we're dealing with up to about 100 points per square meter. It's less than that, but we can achieve 100 points per square meter. Whereas with the LiDAR, we're dealing with easily over 1,000 points per square meter. So there's more than an order of magnitude difference in terms of the density. But more importantly, because the LiDAR is an active sensor, we're getting structural information all the way down right to ground level. And it's good structural information. There's really very little occlusions given the density of information and, importantly, the multiple return capability. And I'll mention that in a bit more detail in a minute. So I think that slide really captures the differences between the optical and the LiDAR technologies. For, in principle, any airborne platform, whether it's an aircraft with a commercial LiDAR mapping system or whether it's a drone-based system, the same principle applies, that you have some limits with passive optical systems simply because of the occlusions and the shadowing lower in the canopy. Now, okay, so what this slide shows you is essentially what we can get with a mobile LiDAR platform. Now, full disclosure, this is from a mobile truck-mounted laser scanner. So we were basically driving along a forest trail and had the laser scanner just scanning around the truck. And this is the kind of information we get. But in truth, you can get this level of information from a terrestrial laser scanner, a mobile scanner, a drone-based system, or a more commercial aircraft-based system. So this is what we're dealing with LiDAR and forestry. Lots of structural information there, all the way from foliage down to tree stems, down to understory. Now, of course, it's not all about point clouds. So I only have one slide on this, but if we're looking at a global scale, right, like I'm just going to go back. Now, clearly that's plot scale, right? We're looking at individual tree level information, but the same information can be represented as a waveform over a much larger footprint. By footprint, I mean the area on the ground. So what we're seeing here is an illustration of the kind of data we can get from a satellite-based LiDAR system. In this case, it's GEDI, Global Ecosystem. Here it is. Global Ecosystem Dynamics Investigation LiDAR mission. A colleague of mine, Laura Duncanson, recently published this paper. Anyway, so you get a waveform that describes the foliage and biomass structure. That can be represented as a cumulative distribution, but importantly, you can see the height distribution of where the biomass exists. Even if you don't get the detailed structure, you do get some level of structural information there. And because these are satellite-based systems, then of course we can map that structural information all around the world. And then you can do things like this, where Laura separated this into different plant functional types. Hypothetically, this could be fuel classifications, I guess, but in this case, it's plant functional types. And you can see how that's distributed in terms of biomass density and regions around the world. So the purpose to this slide is just to illustrate that LiDAR can be applied at a very broad level of scales. So here we've got an example from a Boreal plot where we see an individual branching foliage. Here at a Canadian Rockies landscape level where we're seeing forest coverages and heights. And then here at a regional scale, this is across the Northwest Territories, where we're mapping from satellite data the crown closure estimates. So these are all LiDAR, but of course, just different flavors of LiDAR. Okay, so here's a little bit more LiDAR 101. The next few slides, I'm going to focus on airborne LiDAR because this is what we operate in my lab. For almost 20 years now, we have had our own airborne LiDAR system, and we conduct our own airborne surveys purely for research purposes. But we've had different types of technology as the technology is unfolded. But the basics remain the same. You've got basically a computer control system. You've got a sensor head where the laser pulses are pointed beneath the aircraft. And then you've got these technical components, differential GNSS for positioning, inertial measurement unit to get the attitude and orientation of the platform, electro-optical laser ranging system, a scanner to redistribute points across the swath beneath the platform itself, in this case an airplane, and then a computer processing system to bring everything together. So all of those elements are common to most mobile mapping laser systems. And here's another cartoon just to illustrate the operational configuration. I really need to do something about these little laser pulses. They really should be pulses and not beams. But anyway, yeah, I think you get the idea. Now, one of the advantages of this type of technology, of course, is that you're emitting a pulse of light. And from that single pulse of light, you will encounter multiple targets. Of course, the footprint itself is going to vary in size. You know, it could be very, very small, maybe a few centimeters, or it could be a few meters in diameter. And we can get into the technicalities of that, but I really don't have a lot of time for that level of detail. But the bottom line is you emit this single pulse. That pulse will encounter multiple targets as it approaches the ground level. And of course, more targets in a forested environment from the top of the canopy all the way down. But here you can see an illustration just to make this quite clear. We've got a laser pulse that encounters the top of a roof and the ground surface. So it's effectively split. Some of the energy responds from this roof corner, some of the energy responds from the ground. And so in this case, you'll get a first return over the building edge and a last return at ground level. Now, of course, you can imagine in a forested environment, you're going to get returns from more than just the top and the bottom. You'll also get structural elements in the middle. And of course, the distribution of those returns from the top of the canopy to the ground level will vary with the nature of that forest canopy structure. And so the two obvious examples, or rather multiple obvious examples, which are illustrated here, is you could have a deciduous forest, you could have conifer forest, they're going to have different structural attributes, or you could have a leaf off situation, a leaf off, leaf on situation. And of course, those are going to be represented differently in terms of how many points are recorded in the canopy versus how many are recorded at ground level. And that information alone is very useful, even without looking at the vertical distribution. Just knowing the ratio of points in the canopy versus points at ground level can give you an estimate or an index of the canopy gap fraction or canopy coverage. And so that is actually an extremely useful metric. I'll talk about that briefly in a minute. So of course, given this capability, and it's worth bearing in mind that this technology has been commercially available for almost or around about 25 years now. One of the early applications related to mapping floodplains and floodplain hazards. Now, of course, this image represents the digital surface model. And, you know, in principle, this kind of an image you can generate from photogrammetry. And even 20 years ago, we could generate this kind of data structure from photogrammetry. But the real beauty of airborne LiDAR, of course, is that we can strip away all of that upper surface of canopy, buildings, telegraph poles, so on and so forth. We can remove all of that. And now we can develop a terrain surface, which optical systems can't do because, of course, passive systems can't see into the shadows very well. But LiDAR does this very, very well. So now we've got a terrain map that can be used for a number of applications. But the really big one that led to a real commercial proliferation of airborne LiDAR technologies and sales was in terms of flood risk assessment. So as an example, you see Lethbridge, here's the Old Man River, and you know, we might want to know what's the flood risk for any infrastructure in this environment. Well, traditionally what we would do is we would, well, say traditionally, more than 20 years ago, we would send out field survey crews and we would collect individual breakpoint positions, and we'd put all of that together. We'd run cross sections, and then we'd run hydraulic models. And now fast forward to today, it's commonplace to just fly an airborne LiDAR survey, whereas for every one ground survey point, you've probably got literally thousands, tens of thousands of LiDAR survey points. And so it's actually way more cost effective now to do floodplain mapping using airborne LiDAR technology as opposed to ground survey. So this realization, I say around about 20 years ago, is what led to the rapid commercial adoption of airborne LiDAR. But of course, there's a lot more applications. I'm not going to dwell on this one because it's not really germane to the forestry or the wildfire community. But this is one area of water resources where my lab is actually doing a lot of work, working with the province. Interestingly, we proved this. We did the first proof of concept of airborne LiDAR for snowpack mapping, again, back in the early days, 20 years ago. But it took about another 10 years or so before it got taken seriously. But interestingly, it was taken seriously by NASA JPL in California. And now they have actually pioneered the use of LiDAR for snowpack monitoring from a water resources perspective. And so now we're working with the province of Alberta to do just the same thing, because here we are in Alberta. Our primary water supply comes from snowpack in the mountains. And so that's something we're spending a lot of time on. However, I won't dwell on that right now. Also, of course, water resources, glacial change. That's a pretty big deal here in Alberta. We're losing our glaciers quite quickly, and they're contributing runoff. But what I'm really trying to illustrate here is the use of LiDAR for monitoring. So we can see how we can map changes over glacial ice surfaces in the last slide, snowpack, and in the graphic on the left here, you just saw a seasonal progression of leaf area index modeled from canopy coverage. So that was the ratio of those returns, canopy to ground level returns. And so LiDAR certainly has a lot of value for monitoring because we're mapping and imaging at a very, very high resolution. We can capture changes that occur over relatively short periods of time. And over longer periods of time, we can even utilize the technology for more inventory purposes. So here what you can see on the left, we've got a forest stand map or an inventory map of a number of woodlots in southern Ontario. Incidentally, this is an area just north of Teledyne Optics offices, and so we used to fly over the site regularly. So consequently, that's how we've been able to build up this archive over 20 years. And so you can see this cross section here. We just went through this cartoon where you can see the progression over 20 years, and here we can put it all together where you've got the point clouds from each year, and so you can actually visualize in 3 dimensions how the forest has progressed, how the structural elements, and of course potentially also the fuel elements, have changed over that time. And just to kind of really nail that home and also illustrate how the technology has evolved, here's an example from a cross section from 2000. The day is about 1 point per square meter. We've got a reasonably good idea where the ground is, but it's not perfectly defined. Fast forward to 2020, now we're dealing with around about 50 points per square meter. And so we're 50 times the data density, much more information content. And of course, we can also extract the localized maxima or the localized minima. And so we've got kind of these vectors now describing the upper canopy surface and the ground surface. But of course, it's not just about surfaces. It's not just about point clouds. We want to turn this into information. Of course, that was the first part of the slide. Laura's going to talk more about this aspect, but just to introduce this notion that it's not just about canopy surface models or ground surface models or point clouds, we can extract information from this three-dimensional point cloud. And one way of extracting information from it is turn it into a frequency distribution or a cumulative frequency distribution, which is actually very similar to what we saw with the satellite waveform information. And then we can get these kind of different data structures. Don't pay attention to what's in the key here. These are just different species. But we can get these different data structures that represent different thematic classes of information. They could be different forest attributes, could be fuels, could be species, could be other attributes that we might be interested in. And then we can potentially use this information in some classification procedure. So here we can see different forest species classes. And that's all extracted from the structural information within the point cloud. Sticking with the monitoring, time series monitoring element though, let's just see the canopy height model over 20 years. So we've just quickly flipped through those. You can kind of see how, we've got some forest thinning going on here and here. Anyway, I'm not going to dive into this in detail, but the point is, even just looking at the canopy height model through time, we can observe some disturbance or management related changes. And in this particular case, these are management changes because each one of these little forest stands is actually managed just north of Toronto. Now, one of the questions, of course, is related to growth and yield. And one of the early questions that we had was, well, given we can see these changes through time, what is our minimum repeat interval on an interannual basis in order to get good information on growth? And so if you look at the red squares here, this represents the incremental growth for one of the conifer plantation stands in the last slide that we looked at. And so we can see, we do see quite a significant growth each year. So around about 30 centimeters per year. But the problem is if we map this year over year, that 30 centimeters is around about the level of, it's the standard deviation that we get for each year. So it wouldn't make sense to map on an annual basis if growth is what we're trying to get out of this for a mature plantation. Over 2 years, you can see we're down to about 20 centimeters of standard deviation, up to about 60 centimeters of growth. But really, it's at 3 years where we start to get a statistically significant estimate of growth. Now, full disclosure, this was about 15 years ago when we did this. Technology is advanced. So I think what that tells us is now annual increments are much more within reach than they were 15 years ago. But the bottom line is we are able to detect growth with a high level of confidence now. But we just might need to fine tune the time increment based on different environments. One area where we've taken this a little step further and we've gone into carbon monitoring across the landscape is in BERMS, the Boreal Ecosystem Research Monitoring Sites in central Saskatchewan, in the Boreal Forest. Here we can see different stand ages, harvested 94, 02, 75, and then a mature stand, old Jack Pine. And so here what we see is a growth curve or a carbon-based growth curve entirely derived from LIDAR. And so we've got growth up to 100 years there, because of course the mature site is about 100 years old. And so we're able to do this because we're looking at a chronosequence of comparable forest species over comparable forest site types. And so that allows us to populate the growth curve. And incidentally, this only goes up to 2011, but we do have data now going up to, 2022. So we're gradually populating this entire curve. Now, moving west from BERMS into the Utica region, just north of Slave Lake, Alberta, I have a few slides illustrating canopy height models over this very fragmented landscape. So 02, 2008, 2016, and here we see some change, 2002 to 2016. Now, as I was cycling through those individual images, the 1 meter resolution, it would be hard to see the changes. You really have to pay attention. But as soon as you subtract the images, then a lot of the changes become very, very obvious. So for example, we see riparian growth. A lot of these wetlands are in fact terrestrializing, they're drying up, and we're seeing a lot of riparian encroachment. In fact, some of these wetlands here are completely grown over, just over that 14-year period. So these are landscape evolution processes in action. Here we can see some anthropogenic clear cutting. Here we can see some riparian loss. That's due to beavers. And then here's a big one, kind of relevant to this community in this presentation today. This is the Slave Lake wildfire. And so here you can see the boundary to that fire. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is that, of course, if we have time series LiDAR, even just bitemporal LiDAR, then we can do a lot with assessing changes at a very high resolution. Now, of course, we can look at this and we can subjectively interpret what's happening, or we can go out onto the land and we can calibrate it. But one of the questions we have is, well, how can we more automatically classify what these changes would be? And so that is an area of active research in my lab. And so one of the ways we've done this is to look at change trajectories, not just magnitudes of change, but the change trajectories. And so here what you can see are raster representations of the trajectory of the change at every single grid cell level. So here, for example, the trajectory is linear, and so we have an A function or scale factor. Here we've got a trajectory which is a power function, so we have a scale factor and an exponent. And then here we have a polynomial, which could be some kind of quadratic relationship. So, for example, this could be linear growth. This might be rapid response to some disturbance that, or slow response to begin with. Rapid could be a logarithmic change. That's also another option. Polynomial here, this could be where we've seen some kind of mortality and then followed by some growth. Could be a disturbance response. But the point is, through time, we're going to see different rates of change, different trajectories of change. And if we can pull those out from the LiDAR canopy height models or other LiDAR metrics, then we can feed these in to some kind of classification process. Could be a machine learning process, could be even a regular, trained maximum likelihood classification. But the point is, these could be input data layers. And so just as one example, here's some early work using this technique where we've supervised different change processes. And so here are the processes that we've supervised. Disturbance is just a generic disturbance, by the way. And then here's our map. And so here's a map telling us over time what the nature of the changes and the disturbances actually are. And so that's utilizing the LiDAR in a slightly more sophisticated sense than just simply subtracting models. It's actually looking at the trajectories of change through time. Now, where I want to finish before I hand over to Laura is just on multispectral LiDAR. So a bit of a plug for my lab. This is a technology that we own and operate and fly all year round, mostly across Alberta, but we can also fly anywhere across Canada, and we do. But the neat thing about multispectral LiDAR is it operates in 3 laser wavelengths. So we got near infrared, shortwave infrared, and green, visible green wavelength, which if the system is flying over you at night, you can actually see the green pulses. It's kind of neat to see that. And so here are some of the data products. So LiDAR terrain, yeah, pretty bog standard stuff. LiDAR canopy, again, bog standard stuff. Here's where it gets kind of cool. Here we have an intensity composite, so we can generate more thematic information that look like laser images. This is, in fact, a laser-based image. We're pulling out the intensity from the 3 wavelengths and then generating a composite image. One of the other unique elements of the system is that each one of the laser wavelengths points in a slightly different direction. There's some downsides to that, but I'm going to focus on the advantages. The advantages are, because we have different angles of incidence on the ground, we can see into parts of the canopy and other areas that might otherwise be occluded. So that's one advantage. And we've got different sizes of footprint. So again, that means we capture different targets in slightly different ways. So overall, we get a very rich representation of the 3-dimensional landscape. But of course, we also get this intensity information that allows us to generate these images. So here's just one example of where an image can look like. This is the Wapta ice fields. So you can see the snow and ice up here, so the forests in the valley and the geology. No other reason than just it's a very good illustration of what you can do. You can generate these false colorized composite images in a 3-dimensional sense. Here's another example. It's a Boreal Peatland Permafrost landscape in the Northwest Territories. So we've got the forest here, the fen here, permafrost plateaus here. But the point is, this is a laser-based image, right? This is not looking at point cloud structure. This is just the laser-based image. Now, of course, when we combine the point cloud information with the intensity information, we can generate new data architectures, and there's a lot of opportunity for research in this space. So here are kind of standard attributes. These are the pulse cumulative distributions. We've got a different distribution in each wavelength, over the different stands, and these are the differences by wavelength. So this tells us that each wavelength samples the same forest environment in a slightly different way, or it gives us different information. And then when we combine the distributions of intensities, we're able to create normalized ratios. So these are completely new data structures that we're not entirely, or at least we're not highly familiar with traditionally in a LiDAR context. And then that allows us to do things like this, generate profiles, two-dimensional or three-dimensional profiles of the structure. So we can see the structure here, but it's also colorized with the intensity ratio information. And incidentally, this is a normalized burn ratio. So it's a normalized burn ratio, which is giving us some information about the vegetation properties, possibly fuels, something to look into, but also the structural coincidence of that information. So these are new structures, lots of new opportunities with this kind of technology. And so where I'm going to end before handing off to Laura is just one illustration of how we've capitalized on just the spectral information, not the 3D information, not the point cloud, but just the intensity information, the point cloud, for classification. So here we've got a number of different land cover types. So these were trained. So we know this environment very well. It's the Vivian Forest in Ontario again. So these are different land covers that are represented there. Here's our spectral signatures from the 3 different wavelengths. And if we train these land covers using a very, very simple, maximum likelihood classification, nothing sophisticated here at all, then this is what we can do. So we can actually classify the different land covers just using laser intensity. Now, of course, we can add to that. We can add structural information from the point clouds, and we can do a much better job of this. And one of my colleagues in University of Quebec has done that, even all the way down to the individual tree stem level. So lots of potential with this technology, and lots of potential with integrating laser spectral and laser 3-dimensional information. But without getting into that, I'm going to hand over to Laura so that she can explain more specific wildfire related applications. Laura, do you want to share your screen? Do you want me to stop sharing?
Yeah, if you want to stop sharing, I can share my screen and just carry on.
Okay, it's all yours.
Hey, thanks very much, Chris. So I'm going to carry on talking about fire fuels and post-fire regeneration using LiDAR data. And a lot of this work we've done just over the last number of years. We've been fortunate that, as remote sensing people and folks that do field work and set up instrumentation, we've been measuring a lot of these environments for many years. But in a lot of cases, they have actually burned down. So this provides us with an opportunity to use LiDAR data before the fire kind of burns the ecosystem, and then after the fire has burned through, and monitoring the post-fire regeneration. So this part of the talk is not necessarily going to be about all of the research that we've done, but it's going to tell you a little bit about how to work with and use your own LiDAR data if you want to do kind of some of the work that we've done. So we're going to talk first about methods for estimating fuels from LiDAR data and some of the ways in which we can estimate those fuels using area-based approaches and the percentile methods that Chris talked about. We're also going to look at how to determine ground elevation and depth of burn optimization. And this is some work that a PhD student, Kaylin Nelson, in my lab has been working on for a few years now. And she's gone through and she's tested this with field data at the Horse River, Fort McMurray wildfire just south of there. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit more about combining multispectral LiDAR methods just briefly to look at fire and the normalized burn ratio. And then finally, post-fire regeneration characterization, where we'll focus on the Keno wildfire and regeneration from that, and also some work that we've been doing in central Alberta. So as you've seen from Chris's talk, there are a lot of important attributes that can be measured from LiDAR. And these are the same attributes that are considered to be important with regards to specifying fuels within the plot scale. So these include the live crown length, the tree height, the crown width, the height to the bottom of the crown, but also the understory characteristics as well, and potentially elevation. So these are characteristics that can be observed using airborne LiDAR, as Chris has shown, and also drone and terrestrial LiDAR. So this provides us with an opportunity to not only go to those remote locations to painstakingly measure all of the trees within plots, we can actually observe these structures across a much broader area of landscape diversity. And even though we consider LiDAR as basically like a sampling tool, which connects the dots between our plot measurements to the broader area of satellite imaging, SAR-based imaging, and satellite LiDAR, this allows us to look at the full complexity of these ecosystems, which I think from a climate change perspective is something that we're really interested in when we're looking at fire fuels. Sorry, my slide's not advancing here. Okay, there we go. So what are some of the attributes that we can determine from these LiDAR point clouds? This provides the point cloud for a cross section across the Vivian Forest area that Chris showed that we've been working on and surveying for 20 years. And just incidentally, the Vivian Forest was a place that I grew up in. My house was just down the road from there, so I know the forest intimately well. But here you can see from these dense point clouds, we can start to get an idea of the density of trees within this landscape using crown separation. We can also observe tree height and crown depth with much more detail than we'd ever be able to measure within our plots. And we can also characterize the understory and ladder fuels. Now, crown base height is a little bit tricky because there is obviously some overlap between the understory and the crown base height in some environments. I'll show you what this looks like as well. Here you have a deciduous stand. Again, we can see some important fuel characteristics, the crown width, the tree height, the crown depth, and the base of crown height. But there's also some areas where you'll have kind of some overlap between the understory and that crown base height. So depending on the density of your data and what kind of technology you'll use, there could be some kind of additional uncertainty associated with determining the crown base height. But for the most part, a lot of the attributes that we can see using airborne LiDAR match a lot of the attributes that we're measuring at the plot level. So as Chris mentioned, we're very interested just in a basic sense at what the distribution of these laser pulse returns look like within the canopy. And Chris showed basically the same diagram, and I've admittedly stolen this from him. Here you can see the point cloud distribution within the trees. And then if you take basically a column or an area and you go from the bottom of the ground up to the top of the trees, you can count these distributions and the frequency at which these laser pulses occur through that canopy. And this provides a lot of information, I'm sure you can imagine, of the distribution of those returns within the canopy and the understory. Because if there wasn't vegetation there, then the laser pulse would continue to go through that kind of empty space to the ground surface. So again, this provides us with the vertical distribution of the structure in a way that is quite accessible and it's easy to implement. Interestingly, and this is not exactly the same, but our frequency distribution of the laser pulse returns looks quite a lot like the bulk density that is calculated using field measurements. And even though we haven't determined whether or not these are equivalent, there is going to be some relationship between the amount of biomass in the canopy and the bulk density of that, or the weight of that biomass in terms of fuels. So based on these kind of metrics of the count of the laser pulses, just as a kind of a first indication of what these laser pulses look like within plots and within the broader environment, we can see how these change with different parts of the ecosystem over wider areas. So this is an example from Jasper National Park. And if you're familiar with Jasper, you know that it's undergone kind of different rates of tree mortality due to mountain pine beetle. And so here with this first curve, you can see the point cloud distribution of a healthy lodgepole pine tree. And a lot of the laser pulse returns are found within the canopy because that tree, hasn't lost any needles. It's not dying yet, or hopefully not ever. But if you continue on to the red phase, where the tree has been attacked by mountain pine beetle, you can see that the tree starts to die and it starts to lose its needles. And so we also see this response in the frequency distribution of these laser pulses, where the laser pulses are starting to be distributed kind of further down in the tree canopy because of less reflection, less biomass being there within that canopy. And this is within the same LiDAR survey, but looking at different plots across the landscape. So here's another example where we get to late red phase of mortality. And you can see on the picture on the right that this particular tree has a few red needles left, but it's mostly kind of gray branches. And these branches will start to break off because of snow loading and wind, and they'll eventually kind of accumulate near the ground. So again, you can see this distribution starting to shift more towards the ground surface. This is the late gray stage, so no needles left in the tree canopy. But again, a lot of the laser pulse returns will start to kind of sink deeper into that canopy because there's less biomass. And so you can see this in the frequency distribution as well. And just to let you know that the gray represents, the ribbon plot represents the variation or the standard deviation of a whole bunch of plots with this kind of gray phase characteristic. And then finally, we have the late gray phase with some vegetation regeneration. So in this case, you may have trees, a few trees that are still standing, but there's not many of them. And you have a lot of kind of seedlings and early regenerative growth, but also the accumulation of woody debris near the ground surface. So you can see how the laser pulses have kind of distributed over the chronosequence of change within this landscape. Another example of this is Scotty Creek Watershed, which is in the southern Northwest Territories, which is right within the discontinuous permafrost zone. And I had heard this morning that part of Scotty Creek actually burned in the last week. So this may present an interesting opportunity for further study of post-fire effects on permafrost. But here you can see a LiDAR survey that we collected in 2008 using kind of an older system where we have a lot of the returns kind of distributed in the canopy of this forested environment that's found on the peat plateaus. So any in this environment where you have forests growing is on areas that are underlain with permafrost. And basically the permafrost rises up above the surrounding peatlands, which you can see here in the point cloud, the channel fen, and it allows the trees to kind of rise above that saturated moisture condition, which would not allow those trees to grow. So this is in 2008. This is what it looked like in 2016 using a different LiDAR system. So you can see some of the points are distributed further in the canopy here. But what's interesting is you can see that the permafrost has basically thawed laterally into the plateau. So this, you can see a change in the ground surface elevation here. And then finally, this is in 2018. So a couple of years later, not as much change because we're, the LiDAR surveys are quite close together, but you can also see how the trees are starting to die. But what's also interesting, as Chris has shown, is that we can start to see kind of the growth of shrubs within this channel fen. So we're seeing how these peatland ecosystems are starting to become kind of fuel connected because they're drying out. So this is basically the processes that we're seeing in this environment. And of course, when you survey this using LiDAR over the entire watershed, the rates of change that we're seeing are drastically different depending on those environmental characteristics. So if we were to look at these data sets using that kind of frequency distribution approach that I spoke about at Jasper, we can see how the changing structures in that environment vary through time. So here you can see permafrost plateaus, peat plateau edges where the trees are starting to die because they have too much water and the trees are starting to fall over. And then within the peatlands. And we can see that in 2008, the tree structures were quite robust. We had a lot of biomass in those trees on permafrost plateaus, but over time, these trees are starting to become less healthy. They're starting to die. But we're also seeing the growth of shrubs within those permafrost plateaus. Along the plateau edges, again, we're seeing a lot more kind of returns lower down in that canopy, which indicates that these trees are starting to die and they're starting to kind of fall over. So you're going to get a lot more returns along those plateau edges. And then finally in the peatlands in 2008, there were really no shrubs within those peatlands, but by 2016 and 2018, we have this rapid growth of shrub vegetation in those peatlands. Okay, so how do we determine biomass and fuels using kind of relatively simple methods? And one of the methods that we use is to go into sites where we've flown LiDAR coincident with our field measurements. So we'll set up plots and we'll measure, all the structures within those plots so that we can develop models or LiDAR-based models for mapping biomass and fuel across a broad area. In a lot of cases, we cannot necessarily apply regional allometric equations because those allometric equations may be too broad or they may not correspond well with the local variability of that environment. So in this study, Linda Flada, who is a PhD student with Chris and I, she went out and she harvested hundreds of plots of short stature trees and shrubs within the Northwest Territories, so in the southern discontinuous permafrost zone, to basically create regional allometric models for this rapidly changing environment. And so here you can see her measured total above ground biomass. What she's doing is she's harvesting these trees and the shrubs. We take them back to the lab. She separates out all of the fuel components, the leaves, the branches, the stems, and then she's dried them each individually and then weighed them. And so this is one way that you can get above ground biomass. And then she's developed biomass equations based on volume, which we can then apply to train LiDAR data. So this is what a regression-based model can look like. If you take the percentile distributions that Chris talked about with regards to how the laser pulses are distributed within the canopy and the understory and then the ground surface, you can compare that or regress that with the biomass that's being measured in the field. And you can come up with a fairly simple model for biomass or fuel estimation. So here we've got mean laser pulse height, and we've compared that with biomass from forest plots that have been collected across the western the Boreal Plains ecosystem here, all the way from Burns to Uticuma. And what's interesting here is that we can determine the total biomass, which you can see in the blue for these plots, but we can also determine what the fuel distribution is in gray, or the parts of that forest that burn. So that's the leaves, part of the branches, or a small part of the branches, and the bark, as well as the understory biomass. So we're basically applying an expansion factor for understory. And then if you're just interested in the canopy fuel bulk density, you can determine that just based on the tree biomass as well. So this just provides us with a fairly simple regression-based model that we can apply to a broad range of gridded LiDAR data across a large area. But one thing to consider when you're working with LiDAR data, and I'm not sure if this is evident to everyone, but if you have time series LiDAR data or data that's collected with different systems, they tend to collect pulse, or the distribution of returns can be quite different. And so you need to correct for that. So if, for example, we're comparing 2008 LiDAR data with data that were collected in 2016 or 2022, how those LiDAR systems emit and receive laser pulses can be different depending on how those systems were parameterized. And so this is something that needs to be considered when you're looking at the return distribution and in your analysis, because what you don't want to do is see changes in the environment that are actually associated with the differences in the LiDAR parameterization, and not necessarily the differences in how the ecosystem is changing. So the figure on the right shows you just a really old study that Chris and I worked on in 2006, and I think it was actually 2003 that we did this work, or maybe it was 2004. But here you can see the distribution of the point cloud. The really dense points are collected from ILRIS, which was a terrestrial laser scanner, but you can see laser pulses collected on the same day using 100 kilohertz and 50 kilohertz. So this is basically the repetition rate, 100 kilohertz meaning 100,000 times per second and 50,000 times per second. And the distribution is actually quite different. And what we found was that, you know, even collecting on the same day could result in a 30 to 50 centimeter increase in vegetation height that didn't actually exist in the vegetation. So this is something that needs to be considered. So taking into account all of that and correcting the LiDAR data, you can use the allometric equations to develop LiDAR-based fuel estimates. So this is a study by Sam Durand, who was an undergraduate student who did a thesis with me and Chris. And what he did was he looked at these really long LiDAR-based transects, they're sampling transects that are about 100 kilometers in length. And he developed a hotspot map of the change in the change in canopy fuel distribution from 2008 to 2018 associated with changing peatlands proximal to disturbance. So here you can see in the darkest green the areas of the peatlands, and Fort McKay is right in the center there. We have a lot of oil sands development. Dark green is the greatest change in the canopy fuels summed over per kilometer. So again, as Chris mentioned, we can look at airborne LiDAR data over quite large areas, and we can use this as a sampling technology. But we can also look at very, very highly detailed information using terrestrial LiDAR and drone LiDAR. And here is some work that Zhou Ji, who worked on his PhD with Chris, and he's now working with Chris and I on fire fuels at Jasper National Park. And what he's doing is, instead of using these area-based approaches, he's taking the point clouds and he's using deep learning methods to extract all of the individual fuel components within each tree. So, instead of harvesting the tree and painstakingly picking off the leaves and the branches and weighing all of them, he's basically determining this in the forest using these deep learning methods. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on that, just based on time. But I did want to mention some of the work that we've been doing on depth of burn using pre and post fire LiDAR data. And this is for a site just in central Alberta, Lake Utikuma, and we've been measuring the Utikuma Regional Study Area for a number of years, since 2002. The Slave Lake fire burned through in 2011, and then we opportunistically got the LiDAR system in the airplane and flew over it about 3 months after the fire. And this is just kind of a close-up of what you can see, but based on, if you kind of take away all of the trees and the vegetation from that land surface, you can calculate, based on the digital elevation models, quite simply the depth of burn. You take the pre-fire elevation model and the post-fire elevation model and just subtract them. And what we can see here in the top image is that the peatlands burn a lot deeper than the forested environments, which you can see in kind of gray here. As we know, upland forests really don't accumulate that much carbon in their soils, and they don't have a lot of organic matter. But the peatlands accumulate a lot of peat over time, and they don't burn, historically haven't burned quite as easily because they're quite moist. But we can take this information and basically look at the depth of burn and the carbon losses over hundreds to even thousands of peatlands using this method. So, and of course, just for your interest, we had a thermal camera running at the same time as the LiDAR. So you can actually see kind of the surface energy balance just, instantaneously as the plane was flying over. But one thing to consider when you're doing depth of burn is that if you leave quite a lot of time between the fire and the LiDAR survey, it can introduce some significant uncertainties to your elevation model. And this is some of this work that Kaylin did. She collected about 700 ground measurements across kind of peatlands and transitional zones where they had very little vegetation growth, and then areas where they had increasing accumulation of vegetation growth near the ground. And so one of the things that she found was that there can be confusion introduced by the classification of those laser pulses that reflect from the ground, depending on what method you use. So basically, when we process our LiDAR data, we're separating out all of the returns that reflect from above the ground and all of the returns that reflect from that ground surface. And you can see here, as you get into kind of more vegetated regenerating stands, the point cloud distribution vertically increases. And so you're basically increasing the potential for looking at noise. Now, to really get a good handle on what's going on in this landscape, Kaylin did about 1,600 iterations of the different methods that you could classify that ground surface in these environments to basically hone in on what the best method was. And so here's the same diagram that Chris showed in his part of the presentation, looking at particularly hummocks and hollows within these peatland environments. And as Chris mentioned, because of the tilt angle of these systems, you can actually start to kind of get into these hummock and hollow environments. So this supposedly kind of reduces the uncertainty in these measurements of ground elevation. So what Kaylin found was that when she optimized the classification of ground versus non-ground returns, what she found was that basically if we look right after the fire, the best wavelength is actually the green, which we thought was quite curious, but this is what her results showed when she compared it with her measurements in the field. But when she combined all of the LiDAR returns, like from all of the different wavelengths together, she said that she found a mean offset of about probably about 1 centimeter. But if you look at the cumulative standard deviation of pre-fire LiDAR data collection in vegetated areas versus the post-fire kind of loss of biomass, what she found was basically a standard deviation of about 21 centimeters to 25 centimeters. And of course, this increases as you get more vegetation accumulation. So if you're interested in depth of burn measurements, it's really important to do this right after the fire. And it's also important to look specifically at the areas that have burned more, because you're basically reducing your uncertainty. But when we're looking at depth of burn, what we can do here is we can actually apply an uncertainty spatially across that landscape of the areas that we're more certain about with regards to the depth of burn and less certain. And of course, this has significant implications for carbon losses within that landscape, which Kaylin has shown here as well. Okay, so I'm starting to run out of time and I've got to teach soon, but I'm going to skip through this slide here. But just briefly, as Chris showed, we can determine based on the gridded intensity from this particular system, the normalized burn ratio of this environment, and we can compare that potentially with other spectral responses from optical remote sensing. So I'm just getting to the last part of my talk, and this is looking at post-fire regeneration monitoring. And this is some work that Jesse Aspinall did in his master's. And what he did was he compared again, harvested biomass with all of the LiDAR metrics that he could derive from this ecosystem in Waterton. And what he found was that biomass corresponded, regenerating biomass corresponded very well with LiDAR active normalized burn ratio, which provides us with, it indicates the utility of using these normalized ratios for looking at biomass change. And in this area, we've been surveying Waterton since the Keno wildfire starting in 2018. And we've surveyed it through to 2020, which Jesse worked on, but also into 2021 and 2022. And you can see how the biomass has changed in these landscapes over time. And what's interesting is that 2020 was a very, very dry year, and we didn't have that same amount of herbaceous vegetation regeneration. But it's also interesting because we can see kind of parts of the landscape that are kind of initiating or driving a lot of the herbaceous growth versus seedling growth in this landscape. Here you can see kind of rills where water accumulates. And then finally, Jesse was able to use this method, or the rate of growth, to look at kind of the functions and the drivers influencing the growth across this valley using random forest. And random forest is quite a simple method that you can even apply in ArcGIS if you wanted, or ArcPro. But basically, he used it as a predictive modeling framework for looking at kind of thematic information related to those rates of growth. So this shows a kind of a Sankey diagram of the rates of growth, or the drivers of the rates of growth in 2018, mostly moisture driven. 2019, which is mostly elevation driven, and you can see the kind of the thematic information that can be derived from LiDAR, including the terrain positional index related to moisture, elevation, and radiation. And then finally in 2020, where basically you've got this competition of herbaceous vegetation and everything's growing like crazy. So I think I'm going to leave it here. This is, Chris already talked a little bit about this in central Alberta, basically the encroachment of vegetation into peatlands associated with short return versus long return interval fires. But I'm just going to wrap up as we kind of finish up here some of the take-home messages from Chris and my presentations. So the first one is that LiDAR provides a really effective sampling technology for broader area coverage. It kind of connects the dots between our field measurements and our broader landscape, enabling us to understand how structures are changing across a broad range of ecosystem characteristics. We know that LiDAR doesn't measure all of the fuel attributes that we might be interested in, but it measures a lot of the really important ones in a lot more detail than we could measure in the field. And then finally, we can use this information, and we're seeing it already as inputs into some of these fire behavior models, other ecosystem models, and as a tool for satellite validations, which can help us with decisions and policy. So with that, I'm going to stop. Oh, one more slide, a couple more slides, some references if you're interested. And finally, we have a slide of thank yous and our various acknowledgements to all of the people who've really helped us with this research and have funded the LiDAR systems and our measurements. So that's it for me. Thank you very much for attending. I'm going to have to run in about 2 minutes because I have a lecture to give at 11 o'clock. But, you know, Chris is super expert, and I think he could probably answer a lot of the questions if there are any.
Well, thank you very much, Laura. And thank you, Chris. That was a really interesting presentation. I know it's a huge topic. There's a lot to cover, especially at an introductory level, while also introducing current and ongoing and past research. You guys did a fabulous job. So Laura, if you want to run away, that's totally fine. I have 2 questions so far in the chat. So just a reminder to everyone, if you have any questions, please post them in the chat and then we can do it as a Q&A here. So the first one, I kind of wrote down the time these came in. So Chris, this first question came in when you were talking about intensity composite and your enhanced foliage profile sampling right at the end of your presentation. And the question is, are these laser-based images compiled from the highest points in an area? Is it common to look at different slices in this way?
Okay, well, there's many ways actually we can generate those images if we want to get into the technicality of it. Okay, so the first bit you need to consider is that we might have sub-meter resolution point clouds, right? But because we're interleaving the channels, then we have to kind of look at the data at a slightly lower resolution. If we want the highest resolution, then we're going to take all of the returns. But by taking all of the returns to generate an intensity-based composite, that means we've got upper returns from the top of the canopy, we've got returns from within the canopy and the bottom of the canopy. And so that kind of adds a lot of noise. So I guess the bottom line response to that is, if we go for the highest possible resolution for an intensity composite image like this, then it will be noisy. If we want a less noisy and a more clear image, then we have to go for a lower resolution, and then we can be more selective over whether we just take the first returns and single returns, because that's where we're going to have a much more, for want of a better word, pure response, a less noisy response. So there are some choices that you have to make, right? Depends on whether you want high res or low res. In terms of the slices, Well, I mean, again, it's a matter of choice. You can make slices through the data, whether you make a slice at 1 meter, 10 meter, 100 meters, depends on your environment, depends on what you want to do. But to be perfectly honest, those slices where you've got the colorized point cloud with the normalized ratios is certainly not a normal thing to do. There's a fair amount of effort to do that, and there's no software that I'm aware of that will do it for you. You know, it's a workflow, and it's not a standard workflow. I hope those products get used more and more, and it's something that we're hoping to build on.
So the person who posed that question just added that they meant vertical slices as opposed to horizontal.
Yeah, sorry, my response was about vertical slices.
Okay, perfect. So our next question is, and Laura talked about this, I believe, she touched on this partway through her presentation, but have you standardized intensity settings for data acquisition? Example, different altitude, different scan angles, flight lines might have variable intensity returns. What is the process to make sure intensity values are consistent within multiple flight lines and between multiple projects?
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. There's a heck of a lot of context. In terms of standardization, then no. I mean, we haven't standardized anything. You are constrained operationally with regards to certain sensor settings, because if you want to change the frequency rate at which you collect data, for example, that's going to create dead zones. So there are a number of operational constraints that you just have to adhere to, and you don't have a lot of choice over. But in terms of what I would call normalizing the intensity response, not standardizing, but normalizing the intensity response, then one choice we do make is to normalize by range, laser range to target. And so what that does is it essentially normalizes the intensity response for changes in elevation of the terrain or changes in altitude of the aircraft. It's not perfect, of course, because you have a slight angle of incidence influences. So you can apply a cosine correction, but these are not standard processing approaches. We have done quite a bit of in-house research on using what's known as the radar equation to do a full radiometric treatment. And you can do that, but it's a lot of work. You've basically got to code it. And you can imagine, you know, we're collecting almost 1 million data points per second, and you want to run this over a few thousand square kilometers. It's a lot of processing, but it can be done, and it is a thing. People do this. But the truth is, the real value in the data is not necessarily in terms of its radiometric response. It's more in terms of the relative consistency from channel to channel. And the relative consistency in terms of the intensity is something where we have to really trust the manufacturer with their laser intensity calibrations. And so they tell us that there is a linear response from 0 to whatever on the 12-bit data range of each channel. So, I mean, if we want to have a conversation that's really technical, we can do that. But the bottom line is we only do a very, very rudimentary normalization of the intensities. But it is sufficient that when you look at the intensities over variations in air, in elevation or across the swath, it's fairly normalized. It's pretty consistent. Hopefully that answers the question. I'm not sure.
Thank you, Chris. I think that does. Our next question is, what applications do you see for post-fire LiDAR work where no pre-fire LiDAR data is available?
Well, if you don't have pre-fire, then I guess it's going to be a challenge to accurately quantify the amount of fuel that was burned, or the biomass lost, or the carbon that was lost. You could, of course, use other methods, right? You could calibrate Landsat imagery or optical imagery in order to get the pre-fire component. But one thing you certainly can do is once the fire has happened, you can monitor the regen. And so, actually, that's a good question, because that was the situation we were in with Watershed Lakes National Park. We did not have pre-fire LiDAR, but immediately after the fire, our partners in Parks Canada did fly a commercial LiDAR survey over the area, but we didn't have pre. And then since then, we've been flying twice a year. So we've got an excellent regeneration curve, and that's distributed across different land covers. But the really neat thing is there are pockets that haven't burned. So Rowan, Lynham Creeks, for example, those watersheds were isolated. And on the Alderson Lake side of Cameron Valley, there are these little pocket areas that didn't burn. And in a lot of landscapes, that may be the case. A little refugia, for example. And so you can use those as proxies or surrogates for what the pre-fire landscape would have been like. And so that would be my recommendation. I mean, we've done this in the Northwest Territories too. We'll just take similar landscapes that are adjacent to the area that burned, and then we just fly them and assume, using other terrain indices, that we've got proxy fuel or proxy biomass that represents the pre-fire condition.
Yeah, that actually makes perfect sense to me. So that was our last question, Chris. I'll give it a minute here. Oh, one more came in. Do you see drones as a viable collection method for large areas, or are they more useful in small areas or small parts of large fires to sample the biomass?
That's a good question, because it's an operational one, and it's one that I know the industry is thinking about. And of course, there are legislative aspects to that kind of a question. Now, I mean, of course, in theory, you can fly huge areas with drones, right? But in order to be able to do that, you've got to be flying beyond visual line of sight. And there are strict regulations over whether you can do that, or you've got to have teams distributed. So it's very much a logistical question. It's not necessarily a theoretical conceptual question. I mean, sure, if you've got enough battery power or enough drones can fly huge areas and at relatively low cost compared to aircraft. But here's one of the kind of more applied problems that's not just logistical. It's not just about time. It's not just about cost or legislation. And that is that the lighting conditions over the site are going to change. Other weather conditions can change. And so if you commit to a drone-based survey over a very large area, say, I don't know, a few hundred square kilometers, yeah, you can do it, but it's going to take several days, because you can't collect 1,000 kilometers an hour with a drone. Not unless it's a big, like Predator drone, and you're flying at 1,000 meters off the ground, and now we're into kind of military grade hardware that most commercial operators don't have yet. But give it a few years, I'm sure we'll be doing that. But as of today, there are logistical constraints, there are environmental lighting constraints, and of course legislative constraints over being able to fly drones over very large areas. So yeah, in theory you can do it, but in practice it's just not quite practical. Give it a few years and I'm sure we'll be there though.
So I think you've already addressed the follow-up question, which was, do you see fixed wing drones becoming more popular to address these issues?
Well, they're already being used. I mean, what I gave an example of was the kind of quadcopter, octocopter kind of thing, and they're more popular, I guess. But fixed wings certainly get over some of those problems. They've got much more endurance. They can fly larger areas, longer distances, usually faster. So logistically, fixed wing drones do get over a lot of those problems. But again, that doesn't necessarily get over the legislative or the environmental constraints.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, I'm going to give it a minute or two to see if any more questions come in. We are done at 11:30, so we have about 6 minutes left. And while we wait to see if any questions come in, I wanted to let everyone know that Canada Wildfire will have a booth at the Wildland Fire Canada conference. So we'd love for anyone who's going to be attending to swing by and see us. Chris, I believe you and Laura are also going to be in attendance for at least part of the conference. So if anyone wants to rub elbows, it's a good opportunity to meet some people in person. We're all really looking forward to that. I also wanted to let the people in attendance know that next month we're going to have Neil McLaughlin from the BC Wildfire Service here talking about what comes after Prometheus. And then in December, we're hoping to have a RPAS, or remotely piloted aerial system presentation from a researcher at the University of Alberta. Okay, I have one more question that's come in. What is the recommended minimum density of point clouds for area-based analysis?
Okay, I guess it depends on what you're trying to do, what you're trying to model. But the main constraint is you need enough N in your sample over the area of interest in order to get a significant or reliable statistical metric that you can use for modeling. So there's a lot of ifs or constraints there. But okay, so let's say we're modeling at 400 meters squared, right? Because we're, let's say we're using standard PSPs that are 11.3 meter radius. And a lot of our work does, because that's what CFS used for a lot of their work. We found that even with the old LiDAR data where you're nominally dealing with 1 point per square meter, that's more than sufficient, right? Because you've got several hundred points there. But what if you're dealing with mostly biomass from a single tree as opposed to 100 trees in that plot? Well, that's going to change things a little bit, because if you've only got 1 point per square meter, you might not accurately capture that one tree. So the answer has to be, it depends, right? It depends partly on the area over which you want to model. So if your model is, Landsat pixel scale or 400 meters squared, because that's PSP scale, then 1 point per square meter is usually enough. And today, all of our contemporary data is way, way, way beyond that anyway. So it's not a problem. But if you're dealing with a very heterogeneous landscape, where you've maybe got patchy areas of a single tree here and there, then 1 point per square meter probably isn't enough. Maybe you want to get closer to 5 or 10 points per square meter, so that you'll actually accurately capture those individual elements. Now, of course, if you want to map at a much higher resolution using the area-based approach, well, then it really does depend on what is your resolution constraint. If you want to map at 1 meter squared and have an accurate biomass or fuel estimate at 1 meter squared, then that's where you're going to start having to head up to the tens to hundreds of points per square meter. But you can't answer that kind of a question with a simple, this is the number you need, because it does depend on the resolution that you're trying to achieve and the heterogeneity of the landscape you're dealing with.
Yeah, that makes sense, Chris. I also received a private chat here just asking about whether or not this presentation will be available. It will be on the Canada Wildfire YouTube channel in about 1 week. I'm just going to post that right now in the chat for anyone that's interested. And most of our presentations are available there. There are some that we have not posted, but the majority will be posted there about 1 week after. And just a reminder to everyone also that our webinar, well, typically the second Friday of every month in November, will be on November 18th. So we're giving a little bit of a gap after the Wildland Fire Canada conference for people to settle back in before we get back to this. So looks like the thank yous are coming in for you, Chris and Laura. And I'd like to thank you guys again. That was a really great presentation. And I know at Canada Wildfire, we really look forward to working with you guys in the future to put together some educational material as well. So
sounds like fun. Thanks, Karen.
Okay.
Thanks, Sandra.
Thank you very much.
Everyone.
Yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in today, and we will see you in November.